And at just about 11 o'clock, you are listening to KOPN Columbia, 89.5 FM. My name is Mike Hagan. This is Radio Orbit. I'll be back with you all in just a few minutes. Alrighty, welcome to the program, everybody. Good evening to you. Good morning, if it's morning. Good day. Whoever you are, wherever and whenever you might be listening to this show, welcome to the program. It is Radio Orbit, where we investigate the cutting edges in science and technology and nature and art and music and medicine. And sometimes it can get strange and unusual. It's always interesting, though, and usually pretty cool. You're listening to it Monday, August 3rd, 2020. Hope things are good for you and you're enjoying the evening. It's a lovely Monday night here in mid-Missouri. The moon is not quite full, but it was a day or so ago. And now Luna's getting slimmer by the second, but still quite a large moon out there. Lovely night. Another good night to snuggle up and listen to Radio Orbit, I guess. The moon, I'm probably not going to do space weather tonight because we've got an interview that's going to take up most of the show. But, take a look out at the moon tonight. It's beautiful. You'll get some great views of Venus and Jupiter as well in the vicinity of the moon. And if you're lucky, you can see Comet Neowise. It might be a little bit late by now, but earlier in the evening, some beautiful stargazing. All right, so anyway, never hurts to go out and take a look around, right? Wherever you are. Situational awareness, as they say, you know? All right, regardless, it's nice to be with you on this summer night. Glad you joined me. We'll take care of a little obligation stuff quick and then on to the show, all right? Let me quickly say thank you to the remarkable KOPN staff and crew that keep this station rocking and rolling, both on the air and off, 24/7, 365, a truly awesome group of people that make it happen up here at the Mighty Fine 89. On Mondays, Woody gets it rolling with traditional classic country and Ameripolitan music from 3 to 6 p.m. now with the Real Deal Country Show, more country than ever. Woody rocking out today as usual, playing some great country songs for us all afternoon. I love that show. One of my favorites here on KOPN. And the tech radio guys take over at 6 o'clock, keeping us up to snuff on the wild and wacky world of high technology. Kelvin working it as the usual on Jazz plus Blues equals Rabbit Hole Navigation. And just concluding, New Wave Radio Theater, Arcadia. I'm sorry we lost the last couple of minutes of that. The computer crashed and wasn't enough time to get it rebooted and finish that off for you. Talk about a cliffhanger, huh? Well, I apologize for that. And if you like it, you can go to LA Theater Works and look up Arcadia there. And if you're really dying to hear the end of that play, you can hear it online for free. Okay. Apologize for the technical difficulty, but we got things back in order here, and I'm glad we got it rolling tonight. Yeah, good music, good talk, good news. 89.5 on the dial and streaming all around this wacky world at www.kopn.org. It's your imagination station, KOPN Columbia. Big thank you to all the listeners and people that are participating on the website and in the forum. I appreciate all the feedback, email and Twitter, Instagram, whatever. I sure appreciate it, and keep it up. It's nice to hear from people out there, and I always want people to know that I'm always open to it. You know, feel free to message me, whether it's a potential guest that you might have in mind, or maybe a topic that you'd like to hear covered, or maybe you've got a musical artist that you'd like to share, or maybe you are an artist of some sort and you want to send some poetry or some artwork or something. Anyway, love to hear that stuff, love to see it, and love to share it with other people, okay? All right, last week, the soundtrack from Lin-Manuel Miranda's wonderful musical Hamilton. Little out of character for Radio Orbit, but it usually costs a lot to see Hamilton. And it's such a remarkable production that I thought that I'd share at least the audio experience with the listeners from the soundtrack. And the soundtrack to the play is essentially the play, of course, because it's a musical. And I thought it actually came through pretty good on the radio. And I was really impressed by the play, which I didn't see at the theater. I've actually seen the movie version, which is really just filmed on the stage. But it's great, and it's a worthy look at American history with some modern language, but they do a real good job of telling the story of some of the founding fathers, including Alexander Hamilton. So, last week. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you missed it, it's on the web and available in the archives at my website at MikeHagan.com, all right? You can go to the archives there for the show, and all the previous shows are there, and there's some music archives as well if you're interested in some of the music that you hear on the program. And one last thing, you might also get on the web and go to the Radio Orbit Forum. If you go to my website, there's a little menu, actually a quite large menu on the left-hand side of the main page there, and if you just click on the button that says Radio Orbit Forum, that'll take you over to the to the chat room, to the forum actually, and there's a chat room there as well. But it's just a subreddit for Radio Orbit where I post stories and comments and questions and lots of interesting things there, along with many other people. I think there are some 300 or so members over at the forum now, so I appreciate the new group of folks that have showed up over the last week or two. And yeah, it's a great way to kind of communicate with like-minded folks, or not, but certainly a place where there's a lot of information being shared. And I use it as an archive for interesting stories that I find out there on the internet. If I find something that that I find enlightening or funny or cool or interesting or whatever, I just post it up on the forum, and that way, for me, it's an archive. Even if I don't get a chance to read it, it's up there for later. And oftentimes I'll just scroll through and see what other people have posted as well. So anyway, the Radio Orbit forum, easy to get to once again from the website, okay? All right, tonight I am excited to have my friend Jonathan Zapp on the air with us for the evening. John is a frequent and favorite guest here on Radio Orbit, and certainly no stranger to the program. I always enjoy our conversations, and I'm real excited about the topic and the material that we're going to cover tonight. We'll do that in just a few minutes. If you want to get a leg up, you can check out Jonathan's website at zaporacle.com. That's ZAPORACLE, zaporacle.com. Or you can link there directly from my site at mikehagan.com. All right? Okay, for the tunes tonight, we're hearing some cool songs from a new band. Well, actually, they're not a new band. They're a new band for me, at least. They're called Skin Shape. And we started the show off with a tune called Summer. I'm going to play another one from Skin Shape here. I'll get my act together, and we'll come back and do it up with Mr. Jonathan Zapp in just a few minutes, okay? It's Mike and Radio Orbit, KOPN Columbia. And this one is called Inside.
Inside. listening to Radio Orbit with Mike Hagan on KOPN 89.5 FM.
Yes, it's true. You are listening to Radio Orbit on KOPN, and my name is Mike Hagan. My guest this evening is Mr. Jonathan Zapp. John is a frequent guest on the program and someone who I'm always happy to talk to. He's an author. He's a wonderful video producer. And he's a really interesting fellow who knows a lot about a lot of things, including Jungian psychology and a little bit about how the mind works. And we're going to get right to John now and say, Jonathan, welcome back to the program. I'm so glad you're here.
Great to be back. I love Radio Orbit.
Thank you, sir. All right. What's happening in Colorado this evening, John? Doing okay?
Things seem to be all quiet here on the Western Front.
No pun intended. Okay. Well, I am going to forego the sort of introductory stuff. If people are interested in your background, there are plenty of Radio Orbit programs in the archives that they can learn a little bit more about your background. In fact, our most recent program was in December of 2019. In fact, it was sort of a New Year's show, and I guess we had no idea what we were really in store for at that time. But 2020 has been certainly a rabbit hole of sorts, and I think that's going to be part of the conversation. In fact, a big chunk of it tonight, we're going to talk about something that John calls rabbit hole navigation. But I will mention his website once again real fast. If you're interested, you can check him out on the web at zaporacle.com. That's ZAPORACLE, zaporacle.com. And you can connect there from my site as well. So, all right. So, Jonathan, you have come up with this term. It's called rabbit hole navigation. You actually produced a very interesting video with the same material, I don't know, a few years back, maybe. I'm not sure exactly when. But I found it fascinating, and I would like to talk about that stuff with you.
Okay, great. And again, in case people want to see the videos, it's actually a little playlist of 3 videos, I think.
Yes.
It's my YouTube channel is Zap Oracle, and they're called Skills for Rabbit Hole Navigation. The subtitle's In an Age of Metamorphosis, and there's one that's set in Meow Wolf, and then there's one that's set in my house, and then there's another one that's like a fireside chat with just a slideshow of a few images of me in front of a fireplace. And just in case people want to follow up on my rabbit hole navigation ideas.
All right. Well, they're all very interesting, and I think worthy of a watch. So before we get too deeply into it, let's do a little bit of definition. The term rabbit hole, do you know where it originated and why that's a term that now we use, and how do we use it?
Well, I assume that rabbit hole, as we use it, begins with Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
And which is a cool place for it to begin, because it's a work of fantasy fiction, and I also write fantasy fiction. And so it's sort of interesting in multiple senses, because it's a place that came out of the imaginal, at least in the meaning that it has for us, and in how it functions in Alice in Wonderland, which is not the way a rabbit hole that an actual rabbit would dig out of the ground would function. Has a whole lot more novelty than that. Mm. So to define a rabbit hole is a rabbit hole in itself, in that it's a somewhat undefinable landscape. So if you think about what wouldn't be a rabbit hole, if I wanted to drive from Boulder, Colorado, where I live, to Denver, assuming nothing goes wrong or there isn't, an earthquake or something while I'm driving,
right.
That's not a rabbit hole, because it's a very clear, linear route. Like I can, the GPS can guide me, or, I can just follow road signs.
And it's a known path, a familiar
right,
route.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's highly defined. And lacking in subjectivity, lacking in if it starts to seem subjective, and I'm not sure, if I'm the subject or the object, I better pull off to the side of the road and stop driving, because I'm not in the right state of mind for driving to Denver. When you enter a rabbit hole, however, you just like Alice entering the rabbit hole in Alice in Wonderland, you are likely to lose your grounding. The ordinary reality definitions no longer seem to apply as well. It's a liminal, can be a liminal place, sort of between and betwixt an interdimensional space.
Jonathan, what was that
very
word?
Strange.
Pardon me. What was that word you just used? Did you say luminal or
liminal? Liminal. Liminal. And liminal is an interesting word. I mean, it just means sort of something is between and betwixt. And it's a very interesting concept. Like the liminal times of the day are dusk and dawn, where you're between the night world and the day world.
Yes.
And those are seen as propitious times to meditate or to do magical ceremonies and things like that. But other examples of liminality would be, say, a person of uncertain sexual orientation, an undocumented worker, or somebody whose immigration status is unclear, somebody who's in court proceedings that are yet to be decided, someone with an uncertain medical diagnoses.
What about something like hypnagogia or something like that when you're coming in and out of sleep?
Exactly. Those are the ones I was going to mention. Next, the hypnagogic and the hypnopompic states, between waking and dreaming or sleeping. So in liminal states, things are less defined because you're kind of at the edge between dimensions or between zones. And so you're in this kind of interzone. And I think that was a William Burroughs term. And things are not so fully formed, and strange things can happen, and it's more dynamic, more change is possible than when you're in a more fully formed world, like driving the highway, between Boulder and Denver.
Okay, all right. When we find ourselves in a rabbit hole situation, a situation that isn't so well defined, are those things purposefully brought about, or do they happen by accident, or are we forced into them sometimes, or is it sort of a grab bag of those types of things?
Well, definitely the grab bag. I mean, it's definitely all of the above, of course, because you could be forced into it. You could be, somebody in the 1950s who the CIA is given acid to as part of their, experiments. That would be, you'd get forced into a rabbit hole. In that example, you could voluntarily choose. You could take an hallucinogen or try and have a lucid dream or something like that, or try and meditate in an imaginative sense, not in an emptying the mind kind of sense. And I forget what other possibilities you mentioned, but all of them would put you in rabbit holes in different cases for sure.
I was thinking about when a young woman or man enters the service, like to go fight a war or something, that would be sort of a purposeful introduction of yourself into a rabbit hole. In other words, you have no idea what you're in for. You don't know anything about fighting. You say, well, I got to go fight and learn how to be a soldier or something.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it's also because for many people, going into the military functions is a rite of initiation, which we don't have so much in our culture. So people will seek those out in helpful or unhelpful ways. I remember there was an ad for the Army, probably in the very early 90s or late 80s, and it just shows like a young man with a kind of like blank expression on his face. Maybe he has his shirt off and he's just like holding the uniform in his hands, and he has a crew cut, and the headline of the ad just says green, as if he's just been like newly made, and everything is fresh and it's like springtime. So you go to the Army and your old identity is stripped away, your hairstyle and your ordinary civilian clothes are taken away,
right?
And now you're going to enter a rabbit hole, and that rabbit hole can be like Full Metal Jacket. When you see the person going through basic training and then they're sent to Vietnam, or what was the movie with Charlie Sheen? That was a great military rabbit hole.
Platoon.
Platoon, exactly.
My gosh,
what a great rabbit hole.
Yeah.
War movie that is. but it can also be a rabbit hole from which you never fully recover. So, for example, my dad, who most of World War II he spent in an underground laboratory working on infectious diseases, which gives me some sympathy to some of the abused infectious disease experts in our present pandemic.
Yeah.
But then just near the end of the war, he got sent over to be part of D-Day as a medic. And experience, he was the only person he knew in World War II to survive D-Day, and just had absolutely horrific experiences that he wouldn't talk about, and that required him being hospitalized for a period of time after the war. And then he basically had lifelong, very high-functioning person, but he had lifelong PTSD symptoms that continued even into his 90s,
Wow.
where there'd be these episodes where it seemed like he was, fighting off invisible adversaries, or was somehow like, as if under the surface of his consciousness, the horrors of that rabbit hole were like still looping in the background, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's rabbit holes can be quite dangerous. With the association with Alice in Wonderland, it sounds like a fun, trippy place, but just like somebody who takes 100 tabs of acid and ends up permafried, not everybody survives their encounter with rabbit holes, depending on what they are.
Okay. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the individual life as rabbit hole. In other words, none of us really know the future, and certainly as children, we look at the world in a much more imaginative, fascination sort of viewpoint. But life is an unknown, the future is unknown, and in many ways it feels like just being alive in the world is a rabbit hole. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the video, I make a case that Rabbit Hole Navigator is just an alternative definition of what a human being is. I mean, just think about it. We're living in a womb in this wet, dark world, and then we're thrust through a birth canal. That almost seems like a rabbit hole.
Yes.
And then we just have a whole series of shocking experiences called a human life until we enter another event horizon or portal called death, after which, even more fantastical things may happen. And not only that, anybody, I'm assuming that most of the audience are like me and you, social mammals. Mm-hmm. And if you're a mammal, within 24 hours, certainly within 72 hours, you're going to enter an idioplastic, that is a thought-responsive matrix where the physics will be quite different and things will be quite surrealized, called the dream time. And so that's a rabbit hole that we, and it is a neurological, biological necessity that we must enter for a substantial period of our lifespan.
Of our lives, yeah. Do they know anything, John, as a side note, about how much time we spend I know, average sleep time, but what about how much time we actually spend dreaming, like REM state, that type of thing? Has that been studied, I imagine?
Yeah, I think the figure that I remember is about 30 to 35% of the time. And sometimes I found that I've been able to sleep less than average. I don't set an alarm clock. Mm-hmm. And I have a hunch that I had a hunch for a long time. It was because I somehow developed an ability to have a higher percentage of REM sleep. And then I was actually part of a sleep study at Colorado University where they, have you hooked up to, 80 electrodes or something.
Yeah.
And they actually confirmed that you have a very high percentage of REM sleep.
No kidding. Mm-hmm. I guess that doesn't surprise me. now
I
that
just
think
feel
about
like I've
who
got
I'm
a lot
talking
going
to.
on. I experience a lot of time density too, but they say that also, children probably have a higher percentage of REM sleep because there's just a lot of things are new for them or something, perhaps.
Okay, all right. So back to life though, as our own individual rabbit holes.
Okay. Well, I don't know about your life, but my life involves a lot of high strangeness, and if you're incarnating in 2020, even if you're trying to have a mundane life, it's pretty hard to do because look at what's going on right now. We have but people thought it was weird when Ronald Reagan became president. This movie actor is president. I mean, who would have thought? And now we have this sort of, a failed casino operator, a person who seemed like a caricature of a human being to me, going back to the early 80s, because I'm from New York City, same as Trump.
Yeah.
Bronx to his Queens.
Yeah.
And and for him to be president is just such a surreal thing. In fact, I wrote something called Take the Red Pill, why the Trumpocalypse reveals that we live in a simulated matrix or something like that.
Uh-huh.
People can find that on my website. I've got a whole about 20 articles on Trump. And then throw onto that a global pandemic. And by the way, the fantasy epic that I've been writing been trying to write since 1978, if you can believe that.
Which is called Parallel Journeys, I believe.
Parallel Journeys.
Yes, Parallel Journeys.
Since 2013 begins with a global pandemic.
No
and
kidding.
Two characters living in social isolation. And now it's turned out to be the perfect zone for me to finish the novel.
All right, so let's quickly mention that. Jonathan has a book that he's hopefully going to release sometime soon. It's called Parallel Journeys. You've been working on it for 7 or 8 years, John?
No, I've been working on it. The idea for it was conceived in 1978.
Wow.
The same year when I was 20 years old that I discovered the singularity archetype. But I don't think I didn't immediately start writing it, but the earliest versions that have characters in common and so forth with it begin in the 80s. So it's been a long time.
Wow.
I mean, I'm not proud of that longevity. I'm more like frustrated. I wrote about this in something I wrote about creativity called The Path of the Numinous, living and working with a creative muse, because I've been frustrated for 44 years in that the most desirable form of creativity and participation mystique experience for me, more intense than almost all life experiences, have been in the context of writing this work, but it's kind of like an interdimensional rabbit hole, and I can't control the openings or closings past a certain point. So there have been huge epochs of my life where trying to experimentally write Parallel Journeys then led me into something else. I mean, the one thing that I'm quite grateful for is that the well's never dry. Like, the muse is always pulling me somewhere. Mm-hmm. But I would keep wanting it to bring me back to Parallel Journeys, but it would be like, no, you're doing this now, and that kind of thing. But since 2013, I've had the longest periods of where I've been able to work on it.
I see.
Continuously.
Okay.
Yeah, but with an interruption that started on December 3rd of 2017, when I did like a little focus group and read the first chapter and realized from the feedback that there were kind of fatal flaws in the structure that I had to fix. And then what happened was the next day I had like a 5-hour depression because it felt like I had a superpower that was disconfirmed. I thought I was writing the final journal version of it, and then it felt like I may probably never be able to write this, and I'm probably fatally flawed as a fantasy writer in general. And then that night, and I almost always write in the morning. In fact, it's ideal for me to get up pre-dawn, but I was so despondent that I just decided to write in my journal that night. And immediately, one of my two interdimensional companions stepped forward, and there were just like page after page of like fascinating new insights that I'd never heard before, like what time is like in a afterlife dimension and things like that. So what I found was that I was being, for the next 2 years approximately, really since April 6th of 2020, when I resumed work on Parallel Journeys, I was in what I called my rabbit hole writing years, a couple of years or whatever, where I would just show up, in my study at the same time every morning, and I usually would have no idea where I was going to be pulled, and I would often wake up feeling, grumpy and feeling my, late middle age and all that kind of stuff, and feel like, I'm not going to, just everything feels mundane. But then pretty much as soon as I would turn on the computer, I would just get sucked right into something. And so I've written thousands and thousands of pages, but there are definitely themes. It's not like it's, something completely different every day. But it's been an amazing period But it was also a very ego-challenging period because, my supervisory ego would be like, what the hell are you doing? This is just like some morbid hobby. Like, you're just writing all this stuff that can't possibly be published, all of that kind of thing. But at the same time, all these, I would learn so much, and so many interesting mystical experiences happened, and I knew I just had to go with it. And then I had some little forays into parallel journeys, but then on April 6th, a couple of weeks into the quarantine, and after having done a bunch of different quarantine tasks with the house and stuff like that, it was just the right time again, and it's been the right time since then.
Well, I'm glad you're making progress on it.
I guess.
Yeah, fantastic.
Sorry?
No, it's great that you're making progress.
For me.
I wanted to ask a question about something that I've sort of observed in my own life as with regard to the rabbit hole. I mean, I feel the same way that my life has been a series of certainly unexpected events among expected events. I mean, you have sort of the mundane, but then you have the ultra or the exceptional that shows up every so often. But what I wanted to ask you about is that the experience of looking backward. And now that I'm getting a little bit older, I'm in my mid-50s now, and I look back at my life, and it seems like there's some sort of order to it, almost. I hate to say it, but it's almost literary. It's like it reminds me that somebody wrote it and that there was an editor involved or something, because events that happen. When they happen, they may not seem to be particularly important or relevant or I don't know, something special. But then because of the way that the thing moves forward, those events, by looking backward in hindsight, seem to have some sort of sense that they make. It's like, wow, that event that happened when I was 13 years old, I didn't realize how much that really did affect these things that happened further on down the line, and it seems like sort of a story.
Well, no observation you could possibly have made would be so pleasing to me, because one of my great principles is that story structure parallels life structure, and that understanding story structure and applying principles of story structure is the best, both the best explanatory tool of understanding a human life, and also the greatest tool to have a more magical and successful human life. And so first of all, it shouldn't be completely surprising, because classic story structure is something that grows naturally, organically out of human lives and human culture, and that's why the elements of classic story structure are to be found in basically all cultures. The classic example of a archetypal story structure, of course, is the hero cycle. So Joseph Campbell wrote that famous book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces.
Fantastic.
Because, the hero story, which is sort of a developmental arc that has a lot of roots in, the classics of human development, where you have to break free from the world, and enter a rabbit hole or something. You answer the call to adventure, but there could be a refusal to answer it. Then you may encounter threshold guardians that are, barring the way, but then the helpful figures may come forward and so forth. And so I have found that, if you look at your life as a story, and think about what to do in terms of what will make a better story, you're going to have a better life. And I apply it in all kinds of ways. And one of the things that I do that makes me unsuited for a lot of ordinary, mundane social situations, especially something which I really don't like to do, small talk, is I've applied a rule from screenplay writing and playwriting, where basically in every scene, something of high human value should be at stake. So if you and I are talking about what the local sports team is doing, unless you or I are on that sports team or have some, bet all our life savings on it or something, it doesn't look like it doesn't look like a very good story scene.
Yeah.
There's nothing at high enough stake. Whereas if you're telling me your dream and it has to do with, your marriage that, is on the rocks or something like that, well, then there's a lot at stake in that dream consultation, for example, or the conversation we're having. So I'm always interested. If somebody wants to tell me about a big high-stakes problem they have or something like that, I'm always interested. But if people want to have, like, an amateur philosophy conversation, like, oh, what do you think about free will? I'll give them about 1 minute and then, like, read Kierkegaard or something. like, there's nothing at stake here. It's just like amateur philosophy 101 and most people consider talking about philosophical things an interesting subject of conversation, but the principles, the actors that are on that stage, remember what Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage, all the men and women, merely players. They each have their entrances and exits and so forth. And it's really quite true. What is your life but a succession of scenes? And so therefore my life is a story, either beginning at birth and seemingly ending at death, the story of this incarnation at least, and I want it to be a good story. So therefore I don't want to have dialogue that's going nowhere or that's repetitious or where nothing is at stake and this kind of thing.
Yeah, I like it. So in a way, free will aside, we at least seem to be in some control of our own story.
Well, to some extent, yeah.
Right,
I mean, but it's sort of like if you walk onto a stage where there are other actors who are also, it's one of my oracle cards. I have a free online oracle on my website, zaporacle.com. And one of the cards is called The Other Stars. And so it talks about how, we are the star of our own movie, but it's easy to forget that other people are the stars of their movies. And then if you enter into a scene with another star, the movies may conflict.
Yes.
Because one person has one agenda or one set of reality definitions, and the other, you have to be a very expert rabbit hole navigator to get your movie to mesh with that of another star's movie. And so it's all a very complex and mysterious process. But as far as, many things happen that we do control, but then there are all kinds of other things going on in our story, like COVID-19 or the election of Donald Trump, that don't seem to be in our individual control past a certain point. Whether I wear a mask or not is in my control, but the fact that there's this pandemic seems to be outside of my individual control. But I can extemporize based on this, about, how I'm going to deal with it, based on the fact that in the larger play that's going on, this is now become a major story factor, a major plot development.
Right.
And one thing that probably tempted me toward this whole story view of life is that something that's unusual about my life is an extreme thematic continuity. Even though there are all these very strange and surreal aspects, I look back and I see how they were present all along, and they just keep unfolding more and more. But it's not like once I was a baseball player and now I'm into brain surgery or something like that. There's a tremendous thematic continuity going on. My life feels very storial to me.
Can you share some of that theme, or at least an insight into it?
Sure. Well, one example, I mean, because to express the whole theme, we'll be here for a really long time, but one theme is interdimensional communication.
Yes, we talked about that in December, yes.
Right, and so my first experience with that, I was maybe 2 or 2.5 years old, and I had a experience while I was asleep where ancestors, I just knew that they were relatives, and one later when I saw a picture, I believed to be my paternal grandmother, a woman who died in World War II before I was born. His name was Augusta Zapp, and they told me a series of things about myself. And I woke my parents up, recited a couple of Hebrew prayers I hadn't been exposed to, apparently.
At what age?
And,
At what age, John?
I'd say 2 or 2.5.
Oh, my gosh.
Really early. And And so the theme of communicating with interdimensional relationships was part of that theme. And a theme of rebellion from the human form was an implicit theme, and this I think is a theme that's going on in the collective. I call it, the will toward the glorified body. Sometimes,
yes, I agree with that.
There's part of us that wants to rebel from being in meat bodies.
I agree.
We see this everywhere in culture.
Yes.
So this is like another theme, but all of these themes are sort of thematically related to each other. They're sort of different facets of the same gem or something like that.
Fantastic. All right. I think that's a good place for us to take a break. My next question was on my list that, maybe we can start off with after we take a breather here, but we kind of started talking about it, so it's kind of a good place to stop. But relationships, we were talking about when the star of one story comes in contact or across a star from another story, and then we actually have a relationship between the two, and that's sort of a rabbit hole experience. You have your own rabbit hole life, but then relationships with other people can be like entering additional rabbit holes. Can we talk about that when we come back?
Absolutely.
All right, John, it's great. We'll be back then with Jonathan Zapp. You can find information about John on the web at ZapOracle, ZAPORACLE.com. And obviously, you can link over there from my site. Great to have John with us again tonight. He'll be with us for most of the program till about 1:15 or 1:20 or so. And we're going to take a break right now and come back with John in a few minutes. Thanks, John. Be back in a minute, okay? All right, everyone. It's Mike, and you're listening to Radio Orbit. This is a song by our featured musicians of the evening. They're called Skin Shape, and in honor of Zap Oracle, this song is called Oracolo. right, that one's called Oracolo. Once again, Skin Shape. You're listening to it here. It's Radio Orbit, KOPN Columbia, 89.5 FM. And this program is supported in part by Pizza Tree Pizza. Pizza Tree offers pizza by the slice, specialty pies, and delivery. Pizza Tree is located at 909 Cherry Street, and it is open 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. every day except Monday. More information available at pizzatreepizza.com or on Facebook. All right, back to the program here. It's Radio Orbit, Monday, August the 3rd. If you're just joining us, my guest this evening is Jonathan Zapp. You can find information about Jonathan on the web at Zapp Oracle, ZAPORACLE.com. The topic of our conversation tonight, rabbit hole navigation, life in the world as a trip into the unknown. And we've talked a little bit about our own personal lives being rabbit hole-ish. And now we're going to talk a little bit about relationships and how one rabbit hole can kind of meet another and experience it together. Jonathan, thanks for sticking around. I'm glad you're with us tonight.
Thank you so much. As I've told you many times, you're my favorite interviewer, so it's a great blessing to be on Radio Orbit.
That always means a lot to me. I sure appreciate it. And okay, so rabbit hole navigation. We're talking about it tonight. Let's talk about relationships.
Okay, now I'm going to suggest something very controversial.
Okay.
Feel free to say no. Something that almost any experienced radio host will almost never let you do, and for good reason, is to read anything aloud.
Oh.
However, I'm going to suggest reading aloud if I can read aloud my card called The Other Stars, my Zapp Oracle card. I think I can read aloud a little better than average, and I think it's concise enough and poetic enough that it'll be worth airtime, but that's up to you.
Yes.
Would you like to hear that?
Please, yes.
Okay. So this is Zapp Oracle card 632 of 664.
There's 664 cards?
Yes.
Okay.
It is all too easy to become the star of your movie and to forget that others are the stars of their movies. The same event may look very different in the context of your movie than it does in the movie of another star. We all too easily forget to respect the otherness of the other and expect stars to play the roles we have assigned to them. We want others to live inside of our movie, and when they act from their own movies, we point the finger of blame at them for being different than we imagined. To us, it seems obvious that they would be much better off playing the lovely supporting roles we assign for them. We are easily offended when others go renegade, step off of our script, and begin extemporizing their own roles. It is flattering to recognize yourself as a star, but it is more humbling than many of us can take to recognize that others are also stars. And it begins with the quote, from Aleister Crowley, every man and woman a star. Of course, he's referring to the celestial stars, not the movie stars.
Yes.
Stars vary greatly in size, brightness, and where they are in their life cycle. It is important to recognize that each star is unique, and the variations can be dramatic. It is also crucial to recognize that despite the differences, other stars are cosmic bodies of the same order of magnitude that you are. Each star has its own trajectory and inertia. Although we may constellate with other stars, each of us has an independent nuclear core. When it comes to the other star, our information is woefully incomplete. Usually, even if we live under the same roof, we haven't been there for most of the other star's movie. Since we've missed most of the other screen time, inevitably there are secrets about their movie that we don't know. The other also has secrets about their movie that they don't know. We must respect both types of secrets. Even with our eyes fairly open, we are blind to much of the core identity of the other star. Relating to another star can be like entering a foreign movie where there are no subtitles, or entering a rabbit hole, we could add. Interpenetrating with the other's movie, we find ourselves in a misty foreign culture where traditions and perceptions are quite different. We may do something that has benign intentions from inside our movie, but when it shows up in their movie, it appears as something highly offensive. Inevitably, there will be gaffes, moments when we say or do exactly the wrong thing in another star's movie. And you're the parent of adolescent children, so you probably know this all too well. Similarly, we find that other stars may often say or do exactly the wrong thing from within our movie. When dealing with a different culture, wide allowances must be made for differences in custom and perception. It is not necessarily a bad thing that I have my own movie. I need to live by my own mythology and vision and life philosophy. But I must also respect that other stars have their movies based on their individualized mythologies, visions, and life philosophies. The feelings of the other stars are as real as my feelings, though it often doesn't feel that way. I must live for my own movie, but also be able to peer outside of it and recognize that flickering all around me are the movies of other stars.
Yes.
To work well with other stars, I must recognize the Technicolor blind spot. The Technicolor blind spot is the classic optical illusion that finds my movie more Technicolor, high resolution, and widescreen than the movies of others. The Technicolor blind spot makes it look like others would be happier and more alive if they lived in my movie rather than in their own. If I project my movie into the movie of another star, a third distorted movie is created with a confused melange of images imperfectly superimposed on other images. What I must do, and gently encourage other stars to do, is to project our movies in parallel. When two movies are projected in parallel with graceful precision, they may coalesce for a time into a dynamic third movie that unfolds and develops, enlivened by the extemporaneous collaboration of parallel stars.
Wonderful.
So that kind of, the idea of the other as both a star and an alternate movie is another way of saying that the other is a rabbit hole, and it has to be, because first of all, I don't know what I was before I was born or where I'm going after I die.
Me neither.
I may not remember the fantastic dreams that I had last night. I am a rabbit hole even to myself. And another person is just that much more of an exotic rabbit hole. And I was trying to explain the weirdness of my life to somebody the other day, and I said, not only is my life weirder than you think, it's also weirder than I think, or that I can think.
Yeah.
Because if I could fully understand myself, if any of us could fully understand ourselves, we would know more than any human being that's ever lived, probably.
Yes, I agree. It is just top of the hour here, folks. You're listening to KOPN Columbia, 89.5 FM. My name is Mike Hagan. This is Radio Orbit. All right, John, the reading that you just did from your oracle card, the first thing that popped out at me was the idea that different stars, different individual humans can experience the same event in a different way. And
right.
I think this is so
Not
interesting.
Not just can, but they must.
Yeah, they must, absolutely have to. And even if it's very similar, it's still not exactly the same, right? Because we are all sort of the centers of our own universe, and nobody has the same perspective as you or me or anybody else, because there's no way that they could. We all have to have our own unique perspective. I've thought at times that was maybe like a different angle on the multiverse idea, that it really is sort of a multiverse, but it's not a billion different physical universes. It's 7 billion different individuals that are experiencing their own multiverse, in the sense that we all have sort of a different perspective.
Right. I mean, inside of each of us, I mean, first of all, even what I experience with my physical senses is a time-delayed neurological reconstruction. It's some sort of imperfect simulacrum of the outside so-called physical world. But it's also merely a cultural prejudice to say that the worlds that exist in the individualized worlds, the movies that exist inside of us, are less physical than the outside worlds, because the outside worlds, we know from physics, isn't all that physical to begin with.
Right.
And there's some even suggest it may all be a simulation.
There's no there,
stuff that
right?
dreams are made of.
Right.
I pointed this out in a recent talk, that, if you took all 7 billion of us and you just took out all the empty space in all of our atoms, all 7 billion of us would fit into a sugar cube.
Isn't it crazy?
So people who are a person who is 1/7 billionth of a sugar cube should be careful about who they're calling non-physical.
Right.
And these worlds inside of us, they may be more real than what's outside of us, because it depends on where because there are some who say that the outside physical world, there's an MIT physicist who just came out with an excellent book. He'd be a great guest for your show, called The Case Against Reality. And
was his name Hoffman?
Basically,
is it Hoffman? Is that his last name?
I'll have to look up his name. I meant to look that up because I had a feeling I was going to refer to him, but the book just came out. He's an MIT physicist, I believe, and basically, you could also look up on YouTube, "Space-Time is Doomed." It's a search that he suggests doing, because so many physicists now are saying that the only way that we can possibly unify relativity and quantum mechanics is we have to get rid of the idea of space-time. That space-time is just sort of a construct of the human mind. It doesn't actually exist. And so when we have physicists starting to say things like that, then to say that our inner worlds are the unreal versus the outer physical world, they're reversing that, and they're saying that actually consciousness is the more fundamental thing, and that consciousness then constructs space and time in order to have an experience.
That's one
pretty fascinating hypothesis.
Yeah, it's crazy. That's one that I always have a hard time getting my head around deep time when it comes to this type of idea. Where I get stuck is like the sun, for example. I think that the sun had to exist before the earth, and certainly before conscious creatures existed on the earth. And so I have a hard time giving my consciousness credit.
Right, he addresses that specific example, I believe.
Does he? I'm very interested in it.
It's been a few months since I've read the book.
Uh-huh.
But I heard somebody else who was a scientist speaking on the radio earlier today, and was saying, I've never met anybody who has existed anywhere but the now. We talk about the past and future, but have you ever met anybody who lived a single second of their life in anything other than what was at that moment the now?
Yeah, certainly not. Yeah.
Also, the other thing that's very elegant and powerful in this book is that he makes a case, and he's even able to make this mathematically. You might be better able to understand the math than I am, but where they were able to prove, it's claimed, that we did not evolve because some scientists would object to this idea that seems so solipsistic to them, that, outside reality is just a construct. And they'd say,
right.
Yeah, but, organisms need to be able to function in the real physical world, so therefore they would evolve senses that would, as accurately as possible, show to them what's really out there. And actually, that's not true, even though that sounds so intuitive and common sense that must be true.
Right.
What he was able to show is that actually our senses did not evolve to perceive reality, but to perceive what he calls fitness payoffs or fitness rewards. Okay, so for example, if you're a monkey in the jungle, say a banana is a fitness reward. And if you can see the color yellow and the color is green, it will help you to distinguish the banana. And the fitness rewards are like icons on a desktop.
Right.
If the monkey was seeing, so when I look at my desktop, for example, if I were to see what's really there, I would see these tiny voltage differences. I wouldn't be able to comprehend what I was looking at. If I see it, it's much better if I can see a folder on my desktop, even though it's an icon. It's going to allow me to manipulate the digital world of my desktop better. If the monkey were to see what's really there, well, he would see quarks and empty space, and he'd be completely disoriented. it is much better for him to see this useful icon, the banana, than what's really, in quotes, there. And so you survive in evolution to pass on your genes if you're able to successfully, if your senses and your perception is able to successfully coalesce these fitness reward icons that take what's really there, which is be quite confusing, and turn it into like a desktop icon. There's a mate, there's a fruit, there's a prey, this kind of thing.
Right. Interesting. All right, you just kind of blew my mind there, John. So let me get back to it here.
Okay.
All right, so with regard to relationships, then the recognition that another person is in the middle of their own story as well. If you can actively, consciously recognize that, then you can perhaps have a collaborative experience where you can share things of the personal rabbit hole nature.
Sure, because it's like, the classic thing that actors will say is acting is reacting. So a good actor is not just thinking about what they're supposed to say next. They're listening attentively to what the other actor is saying so that they can simulate a spontaneous reaction to it. So so being a bad fellow actor in an ensemble, which is what we live through in our because we don't usually have a relationship with just one person, but with many, is to not just be a projector. A projector is somebody who's just projecting their movies into other people, but to be a receptor. So if I'm a good listener, and if I'm carefully observing the other person, because people are, through their actions, constantly revealing things. It's just like, if I have a dog right now. It's the first dog I've ever had. The dog performs all of its emotions with its body. By its body posture, it's saying everything about what it feels if I'm able to correctly interpret that.
Yes.
Human beings do that too. Any baby, does that. But at this phase of evolution, we are dissemblers, and we may try and hide our what we're feeling inside, or smile even when we don't feel like it. But then there are these, like what poker players are able to observe, these tells. We use different muscles for a contrived smile as compared to a genuine one, and so forth.
Right.
But if I'm a good enough listener, and if I'm some kind of like empath and stuff, and I'm observing another person carefully, I will be able to learn things about their movie, because they're constantly performing their movie with their actions. And so this way, then I can more skillfully collaborate, because I'm an actor reactor, not just an actor projector that is like stepping on other people's lines and missing their cues and this kind of thing. So it's like a principle in the I Ching that Carol Anthony developed in a whole book that she wrote about relationships based on one hexagram, number 44, which is called Coming to Meet. So the idea is that the touchstone for human relationships in the I Ching is coming to meet halfway, which is a much more subtle and complex concept than it seems. So meeting halfway means, for example, meeting more than halfway might be, I'm giving you unasked for advice. I'll be meeting more than halfway.
Yes.
I go to a party, see somebody I'm attracted to, and immediately hit on them. That would probably be meeting more than halfway. If I go to a party and I see somebody I'm attracted to, but I'm a total wallflower, and I don't even go up and try and start a conversation, that would be meeting less than halfway.
Yeah, okay.
But then let's say I go to a party and I start having a conversation with another star. Now the halfway point is a dynamic, ever-shifting thing. Did that person pause just to take a breath, or are they ready for me to deliver one of my lines? Let me wait another beat and find out. I'm going to examine their body language and, whether their eyes are dilated or not, to see whether they're receptive or whether the thing that I'm saying is causing resistance. So if I'm skillfully following the principles of hexagram 44, meeting halfway, I'm ready to retreat the moment I'm creating resistance, and I'm ready to advance if they show me through their body language, their words, whatever, that they are receptive.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very delicate dance, but it's also much more ethical to follow this principle of meeting halfway. And it means, for example, that if somebody does something that is a huge transgression from the perspective of our movie or from universal ethics, then we lovingly withdraw energy from them, and this kind of thing. So it's there are a lot of principles of the rabbit hole navigation of relating to another star, and we can spend our whole lifetime learning those, but it's still a moment-by-moment struggle, and we're still constantly making mistakes.
Wow.
I've got all kinds of stuff I've written about relationships and stuff, but it's an endlessly difficult thing. Like, it's this live, improv theater that's going on in our lives, and we never get it exactly right.
Wow. Okay. All right.
Almost never.
Very good. Great explanation. Okay, we spoke a little bit earlier in the conversation about liminality, and I'd like to go back there for a few minutes and talk about specifically those states of consciousness in between sleeping and waking, and also perhaps the dream time that's in between those two states, because you mentioned the dream time is in and of itself a rabbit hole that we as individuals experience at least every few days.
Mm-hmm.
So so could you then please review a little bit on liminality and about those states in between sleep and wake?
Well, it's this interzone. And when you are sort of between dimensions, more possibilities pertain. So it's just like, for example, think about driving a car, and if it's daylight out, and I might put on Pink Floyd music or whatever, but my visual imagination is going to be somewhat limited because if it's a blazing, we have this glorious high-altitude lighting here in Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing such incredible surface texture. The specificity of stuff is coming at me. And there are so many cars, and I have to, keep track of them and all that kind of stuff.
Right,
and, lights, lighting up, warning light on the dashboard or whatever.
Okay.
So it's limiting my imagination. Now, if I'm driving at night, there's much less visual information coming in. That leaves much more room for my imagination, but I also can't see much of anything except what my headlamps are picking up if I'm driving at night. If I'm at dawn or dusk, though, I'm at a kind of ideal window zone where I can see the outside world, but it's a bit muted. You see, so it's similarly. If I'm in the dream time, then I'm living, unless it's a lucid dream, I'm living completely in the reality of that dream. And many dreams can, just seem nonsensical in reflection. A lot of them are not the big message dreams, that people bring for dream interpretation. It's like some comedian said, yeah, why was I, last night, fixing go-karts with my ex-landlord and stuff like that. It's just like some absurd situation. But it has its own rules, and that's what you're doing. You're fixing go-karts with your ex-landlord for some odd reason. And then there's also the world of your bedroom or wherever you're sleeping before you're going to sleep. But between those, the reality of the bedroom is starting to get a little wobbly and oozy and melty.
Yeah.
And different images are starting to pop up. You're not quite thrown into one of those specific scenarios, but you're in a little bit of a kaleidoscopic place between and betwixt. And the same thing arising from the dream time, where you're in this interzone between dimensions. And in that place, you may actually have, if you are able to be conscious there, you may have more free will. You may have more ability to see something new because things are in a very dynamic place because there's a bleed through happening between dimensions.
Let me ask you a question about the actual dream state. And this may or may not be an easy answer, but do all dreams, in your opinion, have some particular meaning, or are some just like Terrence used to talk about, just casting a net out there into the sea of mind and just never know what might be picked up?
I'm more with the net idea. Because I think, it says in the Jewish tradition, an uninterpreted dream is like an unopened letter. But that dramatically overstates the case for dream interpretation. Now, I do dream interpretation with people. I started doing it at festivals for people for free in 1995. The only reason why it works is because the dreams that people bring for dream interpretation are not just average dreams. They are like what Jung would call big dreams. They're the ones that broke through the natural tendency to forget dreams as something particularly memorable and like having a message,
right.
And therefore they often can be interpreted. But it's like if I were to say to you, "What did you do last Tuesday at 2:30 p.m.?" and interpret it for me. Well, a lot of it might not be subject to interpretation. Maybe you were having an argument with somebody in Home Depot about, it's not something that gives itself to interpretation. But if I were to, and so I think a lot of what happens in dreams can serve many different purposes and many different functions and have many different sources, because something we conventionally assume is that all dreams are created by our own psyche. But people never really seem to examine, that whether any other explanation or source is possible. Like I've noticed that the dreams of somebody who's not very bright in their waking life can have all the complexity of a David Lynch movie with double and triple entendres and layers of surreal symbolism, and it's all made up on the fly, which even David Lynch can't do in his waking personality.
Right.
So I think that many dreams, we assume that they're made by our psyche, but maybe they're made by our psyche sometimes interfacing with the processing power of the universal psyche. And this is kind of like what Jung called the collective unconscious, for example. And so I think that we can't just assume that we make up all dreams. So dreams come from may come from completely different sources. Some may seem to come from the collective unconscious, while others seem to be just sort of like a part of our brain that's bored and is just like a child mixing a bunch of weird things together and seeing what happens. And so so therefore, after 60 years of dream interpretation, Jung couldn't make heads or tails out of most of his dreams, and I can't make heads or tails out of most of mine because I have high dream recall. So part of the skill, I think, in interpreting, but many people who teach dream interpretation sort of have this dreadful ideological certainty that every dream is divine and there to teach you something.
Right,
and that's and Jung was very careful to point out, do not relate to dreams as the voice of God. But every one of them that these dream interpreters has this didactic approach where they're all there to teach you, and they have these formulaic things. Oh, you dreamt about this, it means that.
Right.
Just like your argument at Home Depot, you might be stretching things to turn that into a big interpretation. However, if I said, tell me about the most memorable thing that happened to you in a relationship in the last 10 years. Now, if you told me that story, well, that probably could be interpreted.
Right.
And be like, oh, well, I learned never to trust that people are who I first thought they were, or something like that.
Yeah.
Because it's like a big dream. It's a memorable episode that's bursting with meanings. But a lot of other things are just sort of experiences that are not meant to be interpreted.
All right. Very interesting. Okay, we are close to another break here. I think let's do that now. We'll come back and talk about phenomenology, okay? And I'm sure that's a word that isn't really familiar to a lot of people. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit. And maybe we can get a little bit into skepticism as well, or true skepticism, as you like to call it.
Excellent.
All right, Jonathan Zapp is my guest tonight. Everyone, you can find him on the web at Zapp Oracle, ZAPORACLE, zapporacle.com. You can link there directly from my site, and it's a very interesting website that John has put together, and it's been a long time. John, I remember when Zapp Oracle first kind of came into my story, and it was back when Kent Stedman was still running cyberspaceorbit.com, and I may have heard. I don't know if I heard you on Jeff Rentz's show or another program somewhere. I forget how you and I actually first got.
It could have been John Major Jenkins.
Maybe it was through John that connected us. But anyway, I was fascinated by the Oracle years ago. It's probably been almost. How long has Zapp Oracle been up? Has it been 20 years? I know it's close.
I have a feeling 2004 sounds about right.
Okay, so about 16 years.
It happened on Halloween. I know it's described, there's documentation in the Oracle itself that tells you the history. We give you the date, but I know it was on Halloween Eve that it came into existence. It wasn't planned. It's just two computer wizards happened to decide to get together and call me on that night.
Huh.
And that's when the Oracle came into being.
Amazing. All right, so check that out, everyone. zapporacle.com. It's an interesting website with a lot of cool information and links to all of John's videos and just a whole bunch of. No, it's a rabbit hole in and of itself. So we'll come back with Jonathan Zapp in just a few minutes. All right, it's Mike, and you're listening to Radio Orbit on KOPN Columbia, 89.5 FM. Jonathan Zapp is with me tonight. He'll be with us for another hour or so. We're going to hear one from our featured musicians of the evening. They're called Skin Shape, and this is Shimmer. All right, another lovely one there from our featured musicians of the evening. They're called Skin Shape, and Skin Shape is primarily the project of a British musician whose name is William Dorey, and as you might be able to tell, it's inspired by a whole lot of different sort of styles, but in particular, maybe the 60s, 70s funk and some soul and a little psychedelic influence, some African music, even some reggae, I think I hear in there. But anyway, real cool stuff, and hope you're enjoying it tonight. I'll play a few more songs before we get to the bottom of the program here, all right? All right, it is Mike, and you're listening to Radio Orbit on KOPN Columbia 89.5 FM. And yeah, shout out to my friend Seth, who I got a couple of people around town that I go to for new music, and a gentleman named Seth, I won't mention his last name just in case he doesn't want it said on the air, but he's a great source of new music for me, and my buddy Jonesy does a great job of it too. So anyway, shout out to both those guys. I sure appreciate you guys turning me on to new stuff. All right, so we've got Jonathan Zapp on the line with us. He's been with us for an hour and a half or so, and we're thrilled to have him. You can find information about John on the web at Zapp Oracle, ZAPORACLE, zapporacle.com. He has a new book that's coming out sometime soon. Maybe we'll talk about that toward the end of the program. It's called Parallel Journeys. He's been working on it for most of his adult life, and I can't wait to have a chance to read it. Anyway, John, hi. Thanks for sticking around.
Thank you.
All right. So I mentioned before the break that I wanted to talk about phenomenology. And by the way, if you're just tuning in, we're talking about something that we're calling rabbit hole navigation. And basically, it's tools that we can find in our own world, in our own lives, to help us navigate strange, unusual, unknown situations and experiences. And John's got a whole list of tools in his tool bag. We've talked about a couple of them, liminality being one that we just talked about. We've got another one now that's called phenomenology. And John, I think most people are familiar with the word phenomenon. There was a movie made that, and I think people have just heard it. You know, it just means sort of an event that occurs in the world. But phenomenology is one that might be a little bit more confusing. Could you tell us a little bit about what that means?
Sure. And by the way, it's one of these things where I was something before I knew the name of it, just like I was a chaos magician before I ever heard the term. Once I did, I realized, well, that just explains in its basic outline something I've been doing all my life, and it uses the same principles that I use, where you don't follow a tradition to create a magic ritual, but just make one up spontaneously yourself. So I've actually I've never even read a Wikipedia article on phenomenology. I read a little bit about it, here and there, like in a wonderful book by Jeffrey Kripal and Whitley Strieber called Supernatural. Mm-hmm. And I'm confessing my ignorance of any subtleties or nuances in the whole field of phenomenology, about which there's a huge literature that I have not read. However, I think I've got to make very good use of the basic concept, and it, Edmund Husserl is a major figure in the field, a German philosopher in the field of phenomenology, but it really goes back to Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant drew a distinction between the phenomenon, that's what we experience, and the noumena, which is what is really there.
Yes.
And we only experience phenomena. So the most classic example that I use is, right now I'm looking around my study, and everything looks very real, though it's a very surreal study. But basically, what I'm seeing is a phenomenon. I'm seeing the various lights in the room reflecting off the topography of various objects, and that reflected light is sending photons, an image, through the simple convex lens of my cornea. And so now it's arriving upside down on the back of my retina, because a simple convex lens will turn things upside down.
Right.
And my retina is basically like a digital sensor, except that it has a hole in the middle where there are no photoreceptors. That's where the optic nerve is there. My brain will just fill that in with what it thinks should be there.
Yeah, yeah.
It's also going to turn that image right side up. It's going to miss all these wavelengths. It's subject to optical illusions. It takes a significant fraction of a second for it to do all that. So therefore, the phenomenon I'm experiencing is a neurological reconstruction, a very imperfect one of a past event, because the
time
object is living in real time, but the reconstruction is happening,
a half a second later or whatever. Yeah.
Posterior to that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, so all we're ever experiencing is phenomenon, and then they give us clues about what the noumena, or what's really behind that phenomenon. And even, as much as it looks like the cup in front of me looks very physically real and like I'm really seeing it, but it's mostly empty space, as we discussed. It's,
with the monkey and the banana, same thing.
Those. Right. It's really an icon. It's a fitness payoff, because by seeing it as a cup instead of as mostly empty space, I'm able to pick it up and have a drink, and so forth. So, so when we relate to, so we're drawing a distinction between the phenomenon and the noumena, becomes especially important is when we're dealing with ambiguous, liminal, rabbit hole, paranormal experiences. And so when I am relating to somebody, to an entity that presents as a deceased friend of mine, I relate to the phenomenon on its own terms. He prefers that I think of him as having continuity with the historic person that I knew, who's been dead for several years. However, I realize that I can't presume that I know for sure what the noumena is, because I have if you know somebody really well, you have a holographic memory of them. We know that the human psyche is capable of splitting off into other psyches, like in what used to be called multiple personality disorder, and now they call it dissociative identity disorder.
Yes.
And or literary characters that you write that take on a life of their own and often do things you don't expect. So the noumena could be my deceased friend. It could be a subpersonality. I can't be entirely sure, even though there are daily paranormal phenomena related to this, because people often naively assume that if something paranormal happens, then that proves that the noumena is what they think the noumena is. Mm. So, for example, if my deceased friend were to tell me, okay, you keep doubting whether I'm really, a subpersonality or have continuity with the person that you once knew who died several years ago, take out a coin. I want you to flip it 12 times, and I predict that it's going to land on tails each of the 12 times. And so if that happens, you'll know it's really me. Mm. Now, let's say I do the experiment and the coin lands 12 times in a row, tails. Now, that indicates something probably paranormal happened, because statistically that's so unlikely. Did that prove that my friend has continuity with the person that I once knew and is a surviving soul? No, because there are many other obvious paranormal explanations that could also account for it. Maybe out of a desire for wish fulfillment, I accessed some telekinetic power I didn't know I had and manipulated the coin toss. Maybe I had short-term clairvoyance, because we have the strongest evidence in paranormal research for short-term clairvoyance, and there's a whole field of paranormal research called decision augmentation theory. I may have somehow known the exact moment where conditions were just right to get a improbable coin toss like that, and fabricated this, exchange with that, this other entity that's really a subpersonality to, have this so-called demonstration happen. I can't entirely, distinguish the noumena from the phenomenon and be completely sure. So the mark of the mature mind is the ability to tolerate ambiguity. Jung once said that ambiguity is the way of life. By comparison, shortly, before the Iraq War, the disastrous one, George W. Bush said, "You're either with us or you're against us." And if you listen to Donald Trump and you listen to other people that create a lot of trouble, they're often they have no room for nuance at all. Everything's completely unambiguous according to them, and not complex. It's black and white. And so the ability to tolerate ambiguity, that's another one of my oracle cards, is the sign of the mature mind. And then this can segue into skepticism if you want.
Yes, absolutely. That's a big chunk of that first video, at least. You devote a significant amount of time to skepticism, and I think it's worthy. I think we should do that as well.
Okay. So the people who call themselves skeptics, like Michael Sherma and James Randi, who are the opposite of skeptics. They're debunkers. They're true believers in a negative. The skeptics were a group of Greek philosophers, and their philosophy was called skepticism. And there's a Greek word, skepsis, I think, that just means to investigate.
Yeah, I think a lot of people wouldn't realize, and I mean, it's always so interesting to see where words come from for me.
Right.
And the fact that this was an actual sort of philosophical practice, I think, is news to people.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm grateful to Raymond Moody, who broke open the field of near-death experience research.
Yeah.
He was not just an MD and a psychiatrist, but also was a professor of logic and Greek philosophy. And so, he pointed out, for example, that you'd have these people say, I'm a skeptic about near-death experience. I think it's just an oxygen-starved brain. Well, notice that's the exact opposite of skepticism. Well, maybe I didn't define skepticism first. Skepticism means to investigate, and the idea that the Greek philosophers had was to avoid reaching conclusions, because once you reach a conclusion, and we now have confirmed this statistically with cognitive psychology and confirmation bias, once you reach a conclusion, your ability to investigate goes way down.
Yep, right out the window.
Right, exactly. They realized, and it's been proven long since then, that your ability to think and your ability to observe deteriorate once you have fixed conclusions. So the idea of being a skeptic is to avoid premature closure, to not assume you've reached the noumena, and to be more of a phenomenologist and accept the ambiguity of things and not arrive at fixed conclusions and, becoming an ideologue or, an absolutist or something like that, a dogmatist or whatever. And so the people who call themselves skeptics are opposites of skeptics. They assume that certain paranormal things can happen, and then they do, it's science's obligation to investigate the unexplained. Well, they just explain away the uninvestigated. Right. Often things that they know very little about. But skepsis means to investigate. But they refuse to investigate. And sometimes this is literally the case. So, for example, I talk about in the videos the origins of the skeptical outfit called PsyCop.
Oh my gosh!
Related to James Randi, was a well-known member and stuff like that, and they're a debunking outfit. And when the organization started, a member of the organization had written some newspaper editorial denouncing horoscopes in newspapers, and we know that even from the point of view of people who believe in astrology, newspaper horoscopes are pretty cheesy and.
Right.
But in any case, except for the free will astrology column of my great friend Rob Brezhny.
Yeah, Rob does a great job, yeah.
Yeah, he's fantastic. But even he says, and I really like this about him, he says, I only believe in astrology 80%. See, that's very wise. But in any case, he wanted he felt newspapers should, have a warning label that, astrology may be harmful to your health and, this kind of thing. It was just assumed that it was complete nonsense, and it doesn't really have any ready logical explanation, a causal explanation of why it should be true. So they decided, so some astrologer challenged them, and they were able to come up with an experiment or an analysis of data to see if astrology were true, because the astrologer said, well, I predict that if you were to look at, professional athletes, that you would find that Mars would feature more prominently in their charts than the average person. And so this was something that they could easily test statistically, not that easily, but they could test it statistically by looking at birth dates and, who were the most successful baseball players or whatever. When they crunched the numbers, the PsyCop folks were very dismayed to find that the data actually supported astrology.
Mm-hmm.
And they decided to refuse to publish the information.
Right.
And there was a lot of, even some people in the organization thought that was, unethical and so forth. But then they, people that were on the board warned them that, they better stop doing research, because if they did research, they may come up with results that be uncongenial to the so-called, air quotes, skepticism. Mm. That was the point of the whole organization. So they had it written into their constitution that they would never again do research. They would never again investigate. The opposite of the skepticism.
Unbelievable.
Skepsis means to investigate.
What a world. All right. Well, let's talk about some more examples, because there's a bunch of them, and I think this really does deserve some time, because we're surrounded by unrealistic skepticism, untrue skepticism.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, one example, this was a little confrontation I had with Michael Shermer, who's a very well-spoken but very smug skeptic, and there was a little public presentation that he gave that I was present for, mm-hmm. and he starts out by saying, "What motivates people to believe irrational things?" In this very smug way of him, right. Because of course he's not motivated, to believe irrational things,
right,
because
right.
He's a skeptic, so he's objective. And so, I stopped him at one point and said, well, what about your motivations? Your whole income, your social identity, your career, everything is based on requires you to maintain this stance of being a skeptic.
Yeah, he's got to hold
there's
that
a powerful
position.
Motivation on your, mm-hmm. view of the world. And so Jung derided this kind of assumption of objectivity that people will have who call themselves skeptics or who have a scientific background, and often the skeptics don't even have much of a scientific background, like James Randi was a stage magician, and I forget what Michael Shermer was. But they just sort of assume that their mind is like this photographic apparatus that's just seeing what's really there and making these, objective analyses. But that is the most naive position you could possibly have. It completely overlooks everything we know about human psychology, where we're just riddled with blind spots and prejudices and so forth. So these people who claim objectivity, like another comic, contemptible example is the philosopher Ayn Rand, who had a philosophy called objectivism, mm-hmm. and she would kind of take on the stance, and there'd be other pretentious followers of her, like Paul Ryan, who would, a lot of the people who like Ayn Rand seem to also have very inferior minds or something, but who just have this smug sense of superiority, which comes across in books like Atlas Shrugged that she wrote, where you're this objective thinker that's, above the average person, and, you are objective. And meanwhile, in her own personal life was just, a comic opera of subjectivities, mm-hmm. and not being objective at all. Her own life was a complete contradiction of her philosophy.
Interesting.
And so, so people who, and often there's a sort of overlap between skeptics and militant atheists, where there's this sort of where they have some kind of prideful assumption of superiority, even while at the same time saying things that would make human life and human consciousness seem completely insignificant. I forget which one of the British atheists said, we're no more significant than mold growing on a shower curtain. But he also kind of said it with this superior attitude, like he was mold of a far higher order than all these fools who don't realize right. that we're just mold growing on a shower curtain.
Yeah.
And but you hear different variations of this, and I talk about this, even comes up in my fantasy novel, Parallel Journeys, where people will say, like, the sheer randomness of things, but then the examples they use to illustrate that completely indicate something completely different. Like, they'll be like, if I hadn't been standing on that street corner at that moment, I wouldn't have met such and such, or the car wouldn't have hit me. But meanwhile, what they just described doesn't seem random at all. A highly specific thing happened as compared to all the other things that could have happened, and they just assume that it was just a random distribution between that and all the other possibilities. And but I've heard one systems theorist say that the assumption that anything could be random may be the worst mistake that science ever made. Because in order for as he explained it, in order for something to be random, the system can't have a memory.
Right, and
if
we
the
know
coin
that everything
remembers whether it was heads or tails last time, that would invalidate the coin toss, right?
Mm-hmm.
But apparently, the system always has a memory.
Yeah.
In fact, if you remember, there was this whole thing called the Black Hole Wars. It was a physicist with my exact ethnic background, another Jew from the Bronx. His name was Leonard Susskind. Went to a lecture about 25 years ago.
He was
given
amazing,
by Stephen
John.
Hawking.
He was an amazing guy. Susskind, I'm familiar with some of his work. Fantastic.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Are you?
Yeah.
I can just relate to him very ethnically. Because we're the same background, but I don't know much about him. But he looks very familiar in that way that, all Ashkenazi Jews are no more than 12 cousins or something, apparently.
Right.
Well, descended from just 100 mothers, apparently. But anyway, he went to a lecture, and Stephen Hawking said something that, like, disturbed him to the core of his being, because Stephen Hawking said that in a black hole, even information is destroyed. And somehow that filled Leonard Susskind with a feeling of wrongness.
Mm-hmm.
And he set about, he set up a bet, I think it was a bottle of wine, between himself and Stephen Hawking.
Mm-hmm.
He believed that information would be conserved even in a black hole.
Yeah, yeah.
And then he was able to prove that.
Yes.
And Stephen Hawking paid up the bet.
Yeah, I remember. And I agree with Susskind. I think that that everything is predicated by something that happened before it. So the universe does sort of have a memory in a weird way. It's like a big recording or something. And in fact, I'd like to ask you as a side note about a story that pops up every so often, and it came up again on in the forum part of my website recently, and that's the idea of the universe as simulation. I'm sure you've heard. Michael Talbot started early on. He had the whole holographic universe idea, but this is more like the universe and our lives and everything in it as a simulation, as almost like some experiment that's being done by some thing or some entity or some other intelligence that's really controlled the whole thing and designed it.
Well, so first of all, this is really not a new idea, because this is what the Gnostics said.
Was that right?
And it was Gnosticism that inspired the graphic novels that the movie The Matrix was based on.
Tell people a little bit about Gnosticism if they're not familiar, please.
Well, I mean, this was, these were both Christians and Jews, and gnosis means inner knowing.
Mm-hmm. Gnosis,
and
knowledge.
They believed that, it was a mistake to worship an outside Messiah, because you had to discover the Christ consciousness within. Like, there's a Gnostic gospel of
Thomas.
Of Thomas or John, I forget it, that says, where Jesus says, and these Gospels are as old as anything in the New Testament. They were just edited out, at the Council of Nicaea or something.
Mm-hmm,
but Jesus says, if you drink from my mouth, I become you and you become me. So that's a very Gnostic idea. You don't worship an outside Savior. The idea is to find your own inner knowing, not to have blind faith, but to discover knowledge from within. So Jung was a Gnostic Christian,
mm-hmm.
and when they would ask him, do you believe in God? He said, no, I know. Now, I don't even use the word gods, but I'm just saying this is what Jung described it as a Gnostic.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the Gnostics believed that there were deceptive beings called archons that had basically created a matrix. This is like the idea of Maya in Buddhism, and that we were living in that matrix. Matrix just means mother. And they called the archons the masters of deception. And they felt that, a lot of this was discovered just at the end of World War II when a Bedouin peasant by the name of Muhammad Ali discovered a bunch of scrolls in the back of a cave.
Yeah, and Qumran.
Brought them home. His mother just thought they were nothing, and she used some of them as kindling, apparently, but these were the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff, or the Nag Hammadi Library, rather, where they discovered a whole lot of Gnostic texts that, dated back to, 1st century AD and this kind of thing. Anyway, which was interesting because we had just been through a very Gnostic experience because Hitler, it's believed, may have had a vision of the demiurge, where, which is like the head of the archons. He seems like a very archon-possessed individual.
Boy, something got into him.
From the Gnostic point of view.
Yeah, I said something got into him, that's for sure.
Definitely, and it was a very surreal thing. I mean, if you think about the idea of this unemployed artist, reversing an astrological symbol, I mean, it seems like an over-the-top sci-fi plot, except it actually happened.
Well, yeah, I mean, tales of master races and rockets raining down over Europe. I mean, this was all sci-fi back then.
Right, and a lot of it was actually inspired by a 19th century fantasy novel by Edward Bulwer Lytton called The Coming Race, where they had the Vril, this master race that lived underground, and that's where, so the Nazis had these hollow earthers. They took this fantasy novel; it sounded so good to them, they just read it as if it were literally true. And but in any case, so we have the idea of the simulation, but just to kind of like connect it with the previous thing we were talking about, with the system having a memory. From a phenomenological point of view, a real demonstration of the system having an uncanny perfect memory, as if we were all happening in a big master computer that retained a memory of every event, like some big mainframe might of every video game played on the platform. When people have near-death experiences, the most classic feature is the life review. And in the life review, they're able to access information that couldn't be explained by ordinary memory. Like, for example, they may re-experience a scene, but be aware of what everyone else was thinking and feeling. Also, as was reported by Dr. Kenneth Ring, who was professor emeritus at the University of Connecticut, in a book that he co-wrote with somebody else, I forget her name, but it was called Mindsight. They documented all these cases of people who were congenitally blind since birth, and yet who had highly visual and comprehended, the visual information was comprehended near-death experiences. Because, from a neurological point of view, if you're congenitally blind since birth, even if through some surgery or something they're able to restore your eyesight, you can't even make sense of the information past a certain developmental age. Your brain just hasn't learned how to process that.
Yeah, it doesn't know the pattern
recognition. But they would have a near-death experience and be able to say, oh, that's what Grandma looked like. And then they would be able to report that, and other relatives would confirm the veracity of that description. So this suggests that there is a memory of everything that happens in your life. I mean, we already know that it doesn't look like memory is stored in the brain anyway, and the whole position of neurological materialism looks like a failure.
Yeah, I agree.
But it seems like the system has more memory than even if all your senses were recording every single thing on a perfect, thumb drive that, or something like that. It seems to have more. It seems like the whole processing power of the universe, this is sometimes called the Akashic record, has this complete memory. So you can look at that and say, like, wow, well, that sounds like everything is happening inside a computer system. So then there have been people, people like the philosopher Nick Swedish Mangrove or something like that. I can't think of it. Bostwick or something.
Okay.
He's the one who really started getting the field taken seriously when he started publishing articles about the simulation hypothesis, about 10, 15 years ago. And there even have been doing experiments. I don't know what the results of them were, but there was something that they were going to test on the subatomic level because there was a certain expected granularity that the universe would have, the physical universe would have, if it weren't a simulation. And certain other things, like some of the simulation theorists say that the reason why we have a speed of light is that if you could travel faster than the speed of light, you would need infinite computing power to stay on top of that. I don't know where that stands, but from my perspective, and this comes up in a conversation between characters in Parallel Journeys, it really doesn't matter what the physical substrate of our existence is. We seem to be agents that have sentience and a certain degree of free will, and whether we're made of quarks or we're made of zeros and ones and an alien quantum computer or whatever, anything that exists is real. So simulation may end up not being any more. It really may be kind of like a nonsensical distinction, especially if you read a book like, The Case Against Reality. But in The Case Against Reality, also talks about problems with various of the simulation theories and versions of it, and why they would not actually work very well if you really think them through. So it's, I think that you don't need a simulation hypothesis of a sort that you're being run in a computer. It may be that the physical, naturally occurring, in quotes, universe is creating a simulation.
Right,
that's the idea of The Case Against Reality, that physical reality is a simulation, a construct, like the icons on a desktop, created by consciousness.
Okay. All right,
we
John.
may be living in the simulation and the creators of it at the same time.
Oh, my gosh. All right, we are at the top of the hour here, so we're going to have to take another quick break. We'll have about 15 or 20 when we come back, and I'd like to touch on the collective unconscious again. You mentioned it a little bit ago, and I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to ask you about that, okay?
Okay, sure.
All right, we'll be back, folks, in just a few minutes. I've got Jonathan Zapp with me on the line tonight. So glad to have been able to have a chance to talk with John tonight. He'll be with us for another half an hour or so, and you can find him on the web at Zap Oracle, Zaporacle, zaporacle.com. Connect there from my site as well. Super cool website with a bunch of information on there. And, check him out. And we'll be back with John in just a few minutes. And meanwhile, we will hear one quickly from Skin Shape. This one is called Life as One. No, I think I'm going to finish the show with that one. This one's called Breathe. It's a little bit shorter. Back in about 3 minutes with Jonathan Zapp. You're listening to Radio Orbit on KOPN Columbia. right, super cool stuff from our featured musicians of the evening. They're called Skin Shape. Digging this stuff. I hope you're liking it too. And you're listening to it here on Radio Orbit, KOPN Columbia, 89.5 FM. We're streaming on the web at kopn.org every Monday night from 11 p.m. until 2. Actually, it's only till 1:30 these days because we've got new COVID-restricted hours here at the radio station. So we will get back to our guest this evening. His name is Jonathan Zapp, and I'm thrilled to have the chance to talk with John. He's been with us since about 11:15, and we're going on 2 hours now, and we could probably do this all night if we had enough time, John.
Well, I probably run out of energy, but sometime would be great.
Well, I'm an
early morning person.
You're an early morning person, and we've only got another 20 minutes anyway. But I will tell the listeners that we are going to come back and do this again next week. We're going to have Jonathan back with us next week to continue this conversation because there's quite a bit more to talk about. Don't you think, John?
Absolutely. Infinite.
All right, cool. So before we get back to our conversation about Carl Jung and the collective unconscious, I wanted to tell you that a listener sent me a note over the break there and said, Mike, did you know that DMT was originally described as a drug called telepathine? Some guy in 1905 named it because his characterization of ayahuasca visions were telepathic. Would this be considered a phenomenological description? I think yes, right? In other words, they described it phenomenologically and then found out what it really was.
Well, I actually talk about ayahuasca being called telepathine in my book, I believe, and I got it from Terence McKenna, of course, who shared that anecdote about it, that early anthropologists called it that, because people in ayahuasca circles would have a consensual visual telepathic experience, where the ayahuasquero would sing songs, but they would have a synesthetic experience,
a shared vision or something.
Convert one sense to another. So they would see it as like a visual symphony. And apparently, after the circle ended, people who attended were able to, just like people who had seen the same movie were able to describe, when the ayahuasquero sang that, part where it created those like magenta-colored mountains with the golden stars twinkling on the, summit and stuff like that. I thought that was very dramatic. And other people had seen the same thing, supposedly. Some substances are boundary dissolving, and human beings have quite a bit of telepathy going on even without any substances. And so it seems entirely probable that, something that this is boundary dissolving as ayahuasca, especially if it's done in in the kind of environment where it's dark and everybody's in a circle and so forth, it gives itself to the boundary dissolving telepathy, I think.
Very interesting. Okay, so you are definitely someone who I would go to if I wanted to talk to someone about Carl Jung. And I had, interestingly, my introduction to Jung was a UFO book. It was the flying saucers, a modern phenomenon of things seen in the sky, or modern mythology.
Right, a modern myth of things seen in the sky, right?
Yes, okay. And because I've been interested in the flying saucer phenomenon since I was just a little kid, and I never really found an explanation that felt right, that seemed like they were getting it. And I think Jung came closer than anybody else, and I think maybe Jacques Vallée, I think, sort of took the ball from that perspective. But anyway, could you talk about the collective unconscious and the superego and that type of thing? Because I still think that that's a remarkable phenomenon if it is really in fact occurring.
Okay, and maybe in some show we did several years ago or something, I might have told the same story, but it's actually that book that Jung wrote on UFOs that was my synchronistic encounter with Jung in 1978. but just in case I didn't tell the story.
Well, if you did, it's been long enough, and I want to hear
right,
it again.
Exactly. So. Anyway, I was set out to write a philosophy honors paper. The chairman of the philosophy department was kind enough to let me go down rabbit holes, but do some rigorous research. And I decided in my senior year of college, when I was 20 in 1978, that I was wanted to investigate why certain sci-fi stories, such as a British 1960 black and white movie called Village of the Damned, had an effect on me. I didn't know anything about the collective unconscious at the time, like a religious vision. I just saw this movie on on an afternoon, it wasn't even nighttime with my dad, and it just, was like a religious vision. And so I also had that experience with reading the science fiction novel by Arthur C. Clarke, Childhood's End.
Yeah, we've talked about that. Yeah.
And so my mom was a psychologist, as I mentioned. I had no idea where to begin to investigate that. She said, well, you should really look into this guy Carl Jung and his theory of the collective unconscious and the archetypes. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, okay, well, that's some kind of lead. So I go up to the collected edition, these impressive black volumes of Princeton Bollingen, collected works
right.
on the second floor of the college library.
Awesome.
But part of me was probably like, oh, my mom told me to do this. This guy grew up in the 19th century.
Yeah, he'll know
Swiss,
nothing.
Son of a minister. What's he going to tell this weird Jewish kid from the Bronx about his sci-fi obsessions?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm like, I look through the index volume, and immediately I see, there's a whole book on UFOs, because that was, that's the beginning of both Childhood's End and Village of the Damned, and I was like you, fascinated with them. They were numinous, as Jung would say, from the earliest age. So I go to that book and I start flipping through that, and then I see at the end of the book, it's like he couldn't let go of the subject. At the end of the book, there's an afterword, and then after the afterword, there's a second afterword,
right.
And then after the second afterword, there's a supplement. And then when I start reading the supplement, my jaw, drops open, because the supplement is a study of a British science fiction novel called The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham. Well, that's the novel that the movie Village of the Damned is based on. So here's my first encounter with Jung, and he might as well have been like a holographic wizard stepping out of the bookcase, holding a torch and saying, yeah, I was looking at that one too.
Amazing.
And he seemed to have figured out a lot of the same things that I was thinking along similar lines, but where he ends the supplement, and this is the end of the whole book, he said, thus the negative ending of the book gives reason for doubt. It was like a note of complete ambiguity, which was delightful. We were just talking about ambiguity.
Yeah,
he
you got to live
leaves
with
it with doubt, and what is the negative ending about? Well, I was able to, because Jung died in 1961, I was able to observe more of the phenomenon. I was also able to stand on his shoulders and benefit from all the work he did, discovering the collective unconscious and the archetypes. And so I know exactly what the negative ending of the book is, and basically it is that, when the ego views the singularity archetype, it's viewed very negatively and apocalyptically. When it's viewed from what Jung would call the self, the totality of all the psychic structures, a transtemporal perspective, it's seen as a transcendent evolutionary event. But in Childhood's End, everything is seen from the point of view of the doctor, who's like the ego, and who views it all negatively, and tries to defeat the psychic children by imagining a wall in his mind. It's an image of psychic repression.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I describe all that in my book. But in any case, let's see. We were talking about. You asked me about. I know we were going to talk about the collective unconscious, but you asked me about Jung and.
Well, and the idea that the saucer could and that people's experiences were actually generated by something. In other words, they were real experiences, but they were somehow generated by a larger, the super conscious or the super ego. I don't know.
Right. Well, this becomes. This is definitely seems like one of the possibilities with the UFO phenomenon, because they're very psychoid. Jung noted that they reflected radar, but he wondered if they might be psychoid objects because, they can change shape and merge with one another. They may be seen differently by different observers. So they seem, as Jacques Vallée, and pick the highest person after Jung to observe the phenomenon, up there with, Jeffrey Kripal and Whitley Strieber and just a few other folks who don't come to premature conclusions.
Yes.
Jung wondered aloud if they might not be exteriorizations of the collective unconscious.
Yeah.
One thing that would seem to support that is a ufology book I've never read, but I've heard about it. That is a very rare one, but that studied all the changes in the UFO abduction, the close encounter reports, where people would have encounters with the beings. And what the author of this book was able to show is that every new twist and turn in the literature of abduction experience or close encounter experience was always preceded by a science fiction story that had the same element and that predated the actual phenomenon. Even if the science fiction story were in some completely obscure sci-fi magazine or something that the experiencer would almost certainly never have read. So it's almost as if the collective unconscious were now primed with that particular, fantastical occurrence for it to occur. So a cattle mutilation researcher, David Perkins, I once met, late Terence McKenna, talked about the self-reflective aspect of the phenomenon as he observed it, and where, for example, there was Colin, I think his first name, I forget his last name, who is a British crop circle researcher. He had
Colin
a dream.
Anderson, I think it is.
Yeah, exactly. He had a dream about a crop circle, a particular formation, design, and then when he woke up from the dream, he got a phone call, and that exact crop circle had appeared. Now, whether that was his psyche generating it, or he had some kind of like remote viewing of it, or who knows what. Right. But the inner and outer become very blurred with a lot of these paranormal phenomenon, where it's what a scientist told Jacques Vallée is, if we wanted one true thing that we could say about the visitors, or whatever you want to call them, is that they are reality projectors, that they are able to appear in our consciousness in any way that they want to. And he said it's sort of like Plato's cave. If you're watching a movie, you can be so distracted by all the fantastical images going across the screen, but if you really want to know what's going on, you kind of have to turn around and look back at the projector. And so it seems like with many ufological phenomenon, it seems like there is a projector that is creating, that can make things appear any way they want to. And something else that seems to be a reality projector in this way are spirits, or deceased human beings, who can come back and appear in a different form, like a shapeshifter idea.
John, and let me tell people that this is still rabbit hole stuff, certainly. So we haven't gone off topic, but flying saucers and near-death experiences are certainly rabbit holes. So absolutely,
and so Terence McKenna produced a. He was very influenced by Jung's ideas about ufology.
Yeah, he was.
He produced a video about that, and he pointed out something that that Whitley and Ann Strieber basically arrived at the same conclusion. Terence said, well, if there were these beings that have psyches, they usually have a hominid form, and they seem very interested in manipulating human psychology. He said, by the principle of logic called Occam's razor, where you don't multiply hypotheses without necessity. The simplest explanation, if you were going to look for an ecology of souls, would be that they are us. And they could be us as living beings exteriorizing our collective psyches or individual psyches, but they could also be dead people, because we don't know what happens to the human life cycle, unless we're a materialist and think we know, after death.
Yeah.
So after death, people may be in psychoid shape-shifting bodies and may take on the form of a glowing saucer or something like that. And so much of the literature that Whitley Strieber talks about, and that Anne Strieber, who read tens and maybe even 100,000 letters that were sent to them after Whitley published the book Communion, and these were called some of the best ones were published in what was called the Communion Letters. Anne Strieber hired a secretary to go through them all. And it was incredible how many of the ufological experiences overlapped with deceased persons.
Really?
Like there'd be a bunch of gray aliens standing around a woman, but one of them she recognized was her deceased mother. I even had a dream related to this. So the overlap between the dead and the visitors is quite profound.
Of interest,
and according to Terence McKenna, when he would show pictures of gray aliens to Amazonian shamans, they would be like, oh, the ancestors.
Okay. All right. Well, we have got time for one more sort of cliffhanger question, but I'll let you give a quick answer, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more next week. But we talked a lot tonight about phenomenology and the way things appear as opposed to the way that they really are. And the one word that you've used a few times is the word numinous, and it's a word that Carl Jung used as well. I guess my question is, can it be experienced? Can the numinous be felt and experienced?
Well, sure. I mean, it is an experience. You know, numinous, something is numinous. Numen means spirit, so something is numinous. It sort of lights up with an uncanny significance. And like a classic numinous experience is if you see somebody who's dazzlingly beautiful in a physically attractive way. You know, they're numinous, like, you know, like Botticelli's Venus, you know, stepping out of a clamshell kind of thing. So that's that's often the most deceptive of numinous experiences is the dazzlingly beautiful person, because they give them a halo effect and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But all kinds of other things, for many people, flying saucers are a very numinous subject. And so I have my whole philosophy of creativity and relating to the creative muse is just called The Path of the Numinous. It's also, people can watch it. It's a YouTube.
Yes.
So numinous can only be experienced because it is a perceptual phenomenon. What is numinous to me, to somebody of a different sexual orientation or with a different set of obsessions, might be the most dull and boring thing in the world. Like a good example is, you know, a numinous experience we've all had is, and a participation mystique experience we've all had, is to watch, think of the best movie you've ever watched, where you're just enraptured by it, you know, whatever it is, Avatar or whatever.
Yeah.
Now, I have a very nice home theater in the basement. I go down and watch these numinous movies. I also exercise down there. But sometimes our dog named Link will be down there when we're all watching a movie. He's not having a numinous experience at all. He's just in a room hanging out with a bunch of people on a sofa, and there's a lot of like flickering lights and like loud noises going on that he just doesn't pay any attention to, because they don't have any, they're not numinous for him at all. What's numinous is, you know, the love connection he feels with particular people on the sofa.
Yeah, yeah.
So to have a numinous experience implies a perceiver, recipient, who is making that numinous connection. And often something's numinous because we're projecting part of ourselves onto it. Like when we see, you know, a dazzlingly beautiful person, we may project onto them our own soul that we have partly disowned. And that's why people will falsely think when they see some stunningly beautiful person, like, oh, that's my soulmate. You know, we were meant to be together. Sometimes that, in some rare case, that could be true, but usually it's just a projection.
Right.
And that may turn you into a stalker, or, you know, give you very unrealistic expectations of how much who that other person is, or how much interested they might be in you.
Right. Very interesting. All right, Mr. Jonathan Zapp, that's a good place for us to say toodaloo for this evening at least, and I'm real excited to come back and continue our conversation next week. For all of you out there, if you haven't joined us for the early part of the show, I've been talking with Jonathan Zapp since about 11:15 or so, and we're going to come back and do it again next week. We're talking about tools for rabbit hole navigation, and that's sort of code for how to get through this crazy life. And it's been a pleasure talking with you tonight, John, and we'll come back and do it again.
Likewise, yes.
Yeah.
We'll visit some more rabbit holes next week.
All right, cool. So once again, on the web at zaporacle.com, your YouTube channel, which is super cool, and there's a bunch of the stuff that we've been talking about tonight that's available there. That's just Zap Oracle as well on YouTube?
Right, yep.
Okay.
ZAPORACLE.
That's right, and I'll make sure that I get all these links up on my site as well. And I'll put up the previous conversations that we've had, too, so people can link to those real easy without having to go search through the archives. But regardless, we will be back again next week with Jonathan Zapp. And until then, John, I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, take care, Mike.
Take care, man. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye. Okay. Wow. Super interesting conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. I sure did. We are going to wrap it up and play one more from our featured musicians of the evening. They're called Skin Shape. This is a song called Life as One. And if nothing else, you can bet that's the truth. All right, stick around for Eric P's Sound Legacy coming at you. Get ready for some cool music action. And, well, it'll be about an hour. We're going to go automated for an hour to keep with our COVID schedule. And then Eric will be with you at about 2:30, and he'll take you till the morning hours, okay? All right, once again, it's Mike, and you've been listening to Radio Orbit on KOPN Columbia, 89.5 FM. My website is www.mikehagan.com. The show is always streaming at kopn.org. Once again, thank you to my guest this evening, Jonathan Zapp. You can find him again at zaporacle.com. And, yeah, we'll catch y'all next week. Be cool to yourselves, and be cool to other people.
The